Quite often, when I'm working with a piece of footage, one of the first things I do is try to increase the contrast in the shot. I try to reduce the shadows and make them darker, but not crushed. I try to increase the highlights and make them brighter, but not make them too blown out or posterized. Well, oddly enough, the shadow highlight effect does the opposite. It helps lift the shadows, it helps darken the highlights. It's not something I use very often, but people with a photographic background who are used to more of a zone system and really playing with those individual ranges really like this effect. The second thing about shadow highlight is it doesn't just say, here's a shadow, here's a highlight. It allows you to pick a radius, a sort of glow perimeter around the shadows or highlights. This allows you to add halos or remove halos from a shot. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at it. Here's a shot that has very extensive highlights, this white-out background and this white airfield, and some dark shadows, such as the doorway to this plane, the wheels, the stripes, etc. Let's select it and apply Effect, Color Correction, Shadow Highlight. And you'll see immediately it has actually darkened the highlights, and it's given a little bit of a lift here in the shadows. This is because it defaults to automatic amounts, its idea of how to reduce the contrast in an image to increase more readability in it. And indeed, see these little tire tracks right through this area of this shot? Those were not immediately visible when this was turned off. Turning on Shadow Highlight has indeed separated some of the details in these highlights. So it starts to give you an idea of what this effect is good for. Now, if you want to go in and tweak, you need to turn off auto amounts. That will then open up the shadow and highlight amounts. When you disable auto amounts, the shadow amount does default to a fairly high setting where it really lifts the dark areas of this image. This was the original image. This is the image at the default shadow amount. You can go ahead and take it back down to where it was, or use it to go ahead and lift those areas and really bring some details back out of your shadows. For a bit more control over it, scroll down More Options, and among other things, you'll see Shadow Radius. This controls the amount of haloing going on in those black areas of the shadows. Watch what happens when I reduce it. You'll start to see some of the highlights creep into the shadowed areas of this plane. Particularly watch this door frame where we have a very strong shadow inside the door and a brighter area outside. You'll really see that area adjust as I play around with my shadow radius. This is a lot easier to read actually if I play around with the highlight amounts. I'll zero out shadow amounts for now and start to increase my highlight amounts. And again, increasing highlight amount actually darkens the highlights. It's kind of counterintuitive. As I really darken it, now you start to see this haloed effect. It doesn't pick just all the highlights and do them evenly. It does sort of a blur and creates a matte to decide what area to affect. And again, you have highlight radius to affect how wide that halo is. You can make it very tight, like that, or very soft adjustment to create a soft blooming sort of effect. And if I pick an intermediate adjustment around there, before and after, I am starting to add some interesting tonal variation to the shot that wasn't there before. Now there are other parameters, such as midtone contrast, to play around with the gamma in the scene. There is a color correction parameter to try to neutralize any color casts. I don't really have much color in the scene. It's basically gray and white, so this does not have a lot of effect on this particular scene. And it does have black clip and white clip, which you may have seen from other effects such as auto contrast and auto color. This is basically saying, should I ignore some of the black pixels or some of the white pixels because they may just be gunk from a poorly cropped image, artifacts from a camera capture, etc. Good to leave with their defaults. So shadow highlight is a way to play around with the contrast and the tonal variations in a scene. Particularly if something's looking too blown out or is lacking details in the shadows or highlights. It's one way of bringing those details back out in the scene or creating sort of a nice glowing filtered version of that scene.